Today on Eagle Eye on Crime, we dive headfirst into the investigation of the double homicide of Allison Sousa and Jeremy Jarvis.
Or he never reflected upon that he remembered stabbing somebody. He just remembered the motion of a stabbing motion.
How was this case solved? Stay with us and hear more from the lead detective, Jerry Connolly. This is an episode you don't want to miss.
Welcome back to Eagle Eye on Crime, the podcast where we dive into some of the most intense criminal cases and uncover the truth behind the headlines. I'm your host, the criminal justice professor, and today we're continuing our deep dive into the chilling Polk County double homicide case of Allison Sousa and Jeremy Jarvis. In our last episode, we walked through the gruesome crime scene, the mountain of evidence that painted the vivid picture of what transpired that fateful day. But today, we're taking it a step further, as I'm joined by the detective who spearheaded the investigation, Jerry Connolly. Detective Connolly was part of the team who pieced together the clues, followed the evidence, and ultimately narrowed down the suspect. We're going to hear from him firsthand how the investigation unfolded, the challenges they faced, and the pivotal moments that turned this case around. So let's dive in. So I'm pleased to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Chief Jerry Connolly, who back in 2003 won the double homicide of Allison Sousa and Jeremy Jarvis. He was working in the homicide unit of the Polk County Sheriff's Office. And before this interview, I was just thinking about how long we've known each other, Jerry, and I concluded we're like almost up to 3 decades. Can you even believe that?
I can't, but I can.
Yes, time flies, time flies.
It does, and a lot of good times.
It was a lot of good times. So why don't you start today's interview with giving our listeners a brief history of your career in law enforcement, where you currently are, and then we'll jump into the case.
Great. I'm Jerry Connolly. I started my career in Boston, Massachusetts in 1997. And I transitioned from Boston here to Florida and worked for the Winter Haven Police Department. And I wanted to have a bigger vision of my career, so then I transitioned to the Polk County Sheriff's Office. I spent the majority of my career at the Polk County Sheriff's Office for about 18 years. I did everything from field training deputy all the way up into a homicide detective. And I also continued my career path in supervision as a sergeant, lieutenant, and then shortly thereafter ended as a captain. And then I transitioned from the Polk County Sheriff's Office to the Haines City Police Department as a deputy chief. I was there for about a year, and I wanted to strive for higher level of command experience. So I transitioned to Fort Myers, where there was a chief of police position open for the Florida Southwestern State College Police Department. And I've been here for about 5 years as the chief of police. And I updated and modernized the police department to where we were just recently accredited through the Florida Law Enforcement Commission of Accreditation. And I love being here, and they treat me well, and I'm enjoying myself.
Awesome. And you also are a professor, correct?
Correct. I'm also a professor. I've got my education. I went from associates to bachelor's to master's to doctorate in human services with a specialization in criminal justice. And I've been with Polk State College, if I'm not mistaken, since 2004. I could be wrong, but I think that's where I started my career, doing advanced specialized training for law enforcement, and then slowly transitioned into higher ed as well.
Perfect. So in a previous episode, I told our listeners kind of the general
how did we get this double homicide case, the evidence, some of the evidence that was collected, including 2 bloody fingerprints, a lot of blood evidence at 2 locations, Unit 1 and Unit 5 of this warehouse complex. And I ended it by posing the question to our listeners on where they thought they would start the investigation. And clearly, we can get that information straight from the horse's mouth because you're with us today. So, how did you start the investigation? Where did you come in? And how did it progress? Go ahead and give us a background, a backstory on that.
So, when Road Patrol shows up, they secure the crime scene to make sure there's no perpetrator still there. They assess the victims and seal off or cordon off the whole crime scene. Generally, we try to push the crime scene out as far as possible to make sure that no forensic evidence is compromised, because obviously forensic evidence is not just right there in that immediate crime scene. It could push out as far as a mile, that could be concerning. So once that is all secured, then homicide detectives are called on scene. On that day, I was called to the warehouse with a team of detectives. I'm not by myself. Thankfully, our homicide unit works as a team, so numerous detectives were responded to the warehouse complex. And the first thing we do when we get there is we tour the crime scene, debrief the first on-scene deputies. We take extensive notes as we progress in the investigation. When you take extensive and detailed notes, these things help you down the road as you progress in the investigation. When you interview associates, family members of the victims, potential witnesses, and potential suspects, we will know if they have any involvement or useful information to the investigation based upon their responses and the information they provide us. So it's very important that not only the lead detective, but other detectives take extensive notes, help process the scene with the forensic side of it, making sure that everything is collected. There's a balance between your crime scene technicians who come there and process, and the detectives that work hand in hand with them to make sure that nothing is left unturned or unnoticed from both ends of the spectrum, from the technicians' end of the spectrum to the detectives' end of the spectrum. So it's very, very important that we microscope that crime scene prior to beginning the official investigation.
So what did you see when you were there that you immediately thought, I need to start the investigation? Was there anything in particular?
So basically, in my 30 plus years of law enforcement service, this was one of the most brutal crime scenes I've ever been exposed to. We had Allison Sousa and Jeremy Jarvis, who were stabbed to death. They were in the back end of the building. Blood was everywhere. So it was a brutal crime scene. It was a crime scene where in our world, we could think this was something personal because a knife was used and it was relentless stabbing, and the individual, the perpetrator, wanted these 2 individuals dead. So we start building theories based upon what the crime scene looks like. But as we start processing the scene, developing evidence, our theories may change. They may change in different directions. You know, was this an intimate killing? Was Jarvis involved with Sousa and a jealous boyfriend showed up? Or Sousa at the time was married, so did she have somebody else in her life? You know, what was all of this? How is all of this interrelated? So we have to get all the pieces to the puzzles and start talking to family, victims of the family, and piecing all this together to figure out what is the best theory moving forward. And as we searched the crime scene, obviously we found large amounts of marijuana. So now we're looking at a different perspective. Was this a drug deal gone wrong, a drug ripoff gone wrong? It's a lot of information for us to tell us what path do we need to go down, or do we go down several different paths? And will one of them lead us to the suspect?
So talk to me about the victim's cell phone. Jarvis's cell phone was found, and it's my understanding that was one of the key pieces of evidence that kind of started you down at least one path. There, as you mentioned, there were multiple paths that you could go down, and you don't want to, have tunnel vision and only look at one path. But what did the cell phone where did that lead you?
So with any cell phone in any investigation, you want to pull the records from the cell phone and figure out who the victim last spoke to, whether it was a couple of people or one or two, or could be 3 or 4 people. Who did they talk to prior to the murder? And that will hopefully lead you to either witnesses or a potential suspect. Unfortunately, at the time, obtaining cell phone records took time. So that wasn't, in Hollywood, they get them within 5 minutes. In real life, we get them within days or potentially a week, because we're at the mercy of the cell phone company. We issue a subpoena, we serve the subpoena, and then it could take forever. And in this case, it took a while. So once we're putting that on the back burner for the cell phone records, and now we're starting our investigation in the other paths of where do we go in finding a potential suspect, and absent that information for now. And hopefully in due time, when we receive those records, then we can take another path as to who did he speak to last.
Okay, so what was the key piece of evidence that you focused on until the cell phone records came?
So one of the key pieces of evidence is they did obtain a bloody fingerprint on the door. We submitted the fingerprint through what we call APHIS to look for an owner of that fingerprint. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we got a response pretty quick within a day that it wasn't owned by anybody that was convicted of a crime. So we now have a bloody fingerprint that we can't tie to somebody. So now we have to look at the cell phone records to say, who did he last speak to? Do those people have criminal records or not? If they don't, maybe we need to acquire their fingerprints so we can start building a cascade of folks to compare the bloody fingerprints to those that have not been ever convicted of a crime or has no criminal history. So again, that took time, but in this case, we developed that this was drug related. So we went primarily down the drug related path and looking for local dealers that potentially Jarvis was having dealings with. So we spoke to many of people in that trade and trying to develop suspects through that route.
Was there any surprises during any of those interviews?
Not really. We had hundreds of Crime Stopper tips, and in all the Crime Stopper tips that generally you receive, people are giving information of local folks that maybe have mental health problems, and they say, hey, this person is worth a look at because this individual is as you could say, the community nut, or the person that people
could have done something this hideous, because it was
right.
hideous. Yeah.
Right. Because they have mental health issues. So maybe that's your person if they are in that area. So we got a lot of those tips. We investigated those individuals. And I mean, I'll be open and honest that there was a couple in there that I thought, wow, they could possibly have done this. But we didn't have anything tying them to the crime scene, nor the bloody fingerprint. So we went down a lot of bad trails on the drug related tips, and and we came up empty on those.
So at this point in time, you've interviewed obviously the living witness, Amanda, who survived and was there to tell. So at this point, you're from her statement, from the evidence at the scene, from the drugs that were recovered, you're kind of believing that the assailant or the person who committed these murders had something to do with Jarvis, but not Sousa at this point. Have you ruled out Sousa, any involvement with someone Sousa knew or?
Yeah, at this point, we were theorizing that Sousa was a potential, based on Amanda's statement, that Sousa was a witness elimination and was not necessarily involved with Jarvis. Again, she was married with children, and Amanda and her spoke to each other about what was going on, but at the same time, Amanda's story pretty much reflected that they were both two people present at the very wrong time. And thankfully, Amanda, prior to locking herself in the office, when she made the 911 call, she caught a glimpse of the killer's profile. Unfortunately, she couldn't catch the fullness of his face, but she caught a profile, and very detailed profile it was, before she locked herself into the closet. So we had that bit of information, but you can only go so much on a profile if, as you're interviewing folks, maybe tack that profile onto the people that you're interviewing and potentially develop the suspect that way as well.
So I assume at some point you got the cell phone records, and what happened with that?
So we eventually got the cell phone records, and of course, Thomas Richterink was the last person that Jarvis spoke to. So we sent a team of detectives out to Richterink's house. At that point, Richterink actually had cut his hair, changed his appearance somewhat, not enough, I think, to help with the profile. But at the time, the team of detectives didn't necessarily make that link when they went out and spoke to him. He was very cooperative. He allowed them to search his apartment at the time, and they didn't find anything in his apartment. So at that point, they no longer, well, we still deemed him as a potential, but the focus of the investigation wasn't necessarily on him at the time.
So what happened then? How did the investigation change?
So eventually, we went back out, myself and actually another detective went back out to re-interview Richterink. And at that point, he started to become unavailable for us. He was acting very oddly. He would disappear for a period of time. So that started heightening our senses that, this doesn't sound right. Because initially he was cooperative, and now he's not being cooperative with us. It came to the point where his parents were alerted by his erratic behavior. He was actually sleeping on top of their roof of their house at night, and just acting very erratic. And one of actually Crime Stopper tips that we did receive eventually was that a person driving by the warehouse complex actually saw Richterink walking from Jarvis's unit to the construction unit casually. And as he's walking casually, he didn't notice anything specific, a knife in his hand or anything, or he was full of blood. That wasn't in the tip, but also what was in the tip was a blue truck. A blue truck was parked outside of the Jarvis's warehouse. So taking that tip, and we were looking for Richterink, we actually went to the parents' house, and when we got to the parents' house, and they lived near Dundee, there was a blue truck in the driveway, and it was the father's blue truck. So at that point, we looked at the blue truck, we looked in the blue truck, and we noticed there was some discoloration on the seats. It just didn't look right to us. So eventually We spoke to Dad. We asked Dad if we could tow the truck and process the truck. He didn't have any problems with that, which we did. We processed the truck. They actually put some spray in the interior of the truck, which illuminates any type of blood that may have been in the truck, even if it was cleaned up. And the illumination came up that there was blood in the truck and on the seat, where we believe that he put the knife on the seat. It actually was kind of like shaped as the knife on the
Oh,
seat.
wow.
And there was blood in the truck. So at that point, that really detailed to us that we have our potential suspect. And that's when we went further into trying to get him to come do an interview with us down at the homicide office.
Okay. When he was being cooperative with you and you asked him, you know, we found your phone number on this homicide victim's cell phone, that's why we're here. Was he admitting to having any kind of relationship with Jarvis, or was he denying knowledge of the victims completely when he was being cooperative?
When he was being cooperative, he then said, "Yeah, I was getting my marijuana from Jarvis. He was my dealer."
Okay.
And that eventually led to his one piece of his defense in court, that where he arrived at the scene of the crime after it was committed. And this was his statement or his defense in court, that he arrived there, he saw what had happened, the drug dealers that were there that committed the crime threatened him and his loved ones that if he would say anything, that he and his loved ones would be killed as well. So that statement came out later in court. He didn't give that to us initially, but that was he was working up to that, to when he got to trial.
So what did he tell you? I mean, you said you had an interview with him. He came to the office on his own accord. So what did he tell you?
So the parents voluntarily drove him to our office. Once we got down to the office, we ran a criminal history on him. He had no criminal history.
Okay,
So
so that goes along with the fingerprint with no criminal history. So there's another check.
correct. So before we started the interview, we asked him, "Hey, can we fingerprint you? If that's possible." He said, "Yeah, no problem." So we fingerprinted him, gave the fingerprint cards to the analyst. So when we started the interview with him, the analyst was comparing the fingerprint immediately. And then we received information on our cell phones that the print matched. So it verified every feeling that we had, or theory that we were developing, that he wasn't in fact the suspect. So once we got that confirmation, that's when the interview started to get more intense with him to get a confession. And during the interview, he then started to talk about, well, prior to the interview, knowing what his potential involvement was, I interviewed a criminal justice professor at a local university that he was taking criminal justice courses at. And I asked the professor, I said, so what materials or what literature are you teaching him this past semester that you had him? So he was talking about serial killer type behaviors or excuses, or different type of information that, you know, what a serial killer or a murderer would experience, and then given information in trial to excuse them out of the crime. And one of the key pieces of literature that he had found, and it was basically a blacked out scenario where the individual would say, "I blacked out, I killed somebody, and then I regained consciousness, and I don't remember what I did."
So this
Well,
is what the professor was teaching about. A serial killer had been arrested. In his defense, he was using, "I blacked out, I don't know what I did." And this is what Rick Drink was being taught in college, right?
Correct.
Okay, go ahead.
And I actually collected that curriculum and submitted it as evidence in the case. But during the interview, that's exactly what his excuse was during the interview, was that, and he used the exact same terminology of what it called a snapshot, where he would black out, but he would have pictures of things that he may have done during that blackout in his mind. So he had little snapshots of what he may have done during this blackout phase. So in the interview, I started to press him and say, well, in those snapshots, what were you doing? And he'd start to describe it to me. And I told him, no, I really want you to show me, physically show me. So he actually physically showed me where he would raise up his arm like he had a knife and he was in a stabbing motion, but he doesn't remember the stabbing. He just remembered of raising up his arm with a knife during this blackout phase.
We actually have a picture. So here's, go ahead, Jerry. You can kind of describe what is happening in this interview. You all sit pretty close to the suspect, gain some rapport, and then this is when you've asked him to show you. Is this
correct? This was the time where he said he had a snapshot during his blackout of what he may have remembered. So again, I told him, well, show me, instead of describing it to me, show me what you saw. And he raised his arm just as in the photo there, as he had pretending he had a knife in his hand, and he was showing me what he was doing, but he never told me, or he never reflected upon that he remembered stabbing somebody. He just remembered the motion of a stabbing motion. So thus he was trying to separate himself from Jarvis and not admit to stabbing Jarvis, but he just had this snapshot photo in his blackout phase.
Did he remember any other snapshots?
No, that was pretty much, it was fairly short. He in what he was remembering in his snapshots, but again, I think that was the most damning part of the interview, was him physically showing us what he remembered as far as a stabbing motion, as opposed to him just describing it to us.
Right.
And him physically showing us, I think, was very carried a lot of weight with the jury as well, and in trial to show them that I think his analogy was not correct, or it wasn't true. It was just basically him giving us an excuse as to separating himself from the actual crime itself.
From the guilt of it, the actual,
Correct.
the guilty mind of the actual crime. Was there
Correct.
anything else that he talked to you about in that interview? Like what happened to the evidence, the knife, where was that? Did he say anything about that?
He did tell us that he threw the knife off of a bridge as he was driving the truck back to his parents' house, but we never recovered the knife. We did search the area of where he alluded to, but we never found the knife. So we suspect that he got rid of the knife maybe when he got to his apartment, along with clothing, probably threw it all away in the garbage. Because so much time had passed before we got the cell phone records, we couldn't go out and start checking dumpsters and his trash, because that's already long gone. And he came in probably a week to 2 weeks after the crime was committed. His name was dumped in with the cell phone record. So we lost out on the actual physical evidence of the weapon, but again, we had blood in the dad's truck that helped link him to the truck, and the Crime Stopper tip, the witness that said he saw the truck parked outside during the actual time frame of the crime.
Does he remember leaving the scene, or?
Yes.
I mean, okay.
He remembers leaving the scene and he had blood on him, and driving back to his parents' house, but he doesn't know why he had blood on him, and he was scared, so he threw the knife over the bridge and drove back to his parents' house. And that's when that story changed from the interview into trial, where he showed up with the, when after it was committed, but the drug dealers were still there, because he was trying to explain away the bloody fingerprint on the door.
So, the evidence that was gathered, did it hold up in court?
Yeah, all the evidence held up in court. The forensic and physical evidence held up in court. The only issue that we ran across was we had a pre-printed Miranda warning form from the Polk County Sheriff's Office, which is generally generated by legal counsel for the sheriff's office, and then they provide us with that information, and then we use it in our investigation. So at the time, across the country, there was a lot of agencies was using the Miranda warning verbiage that we were using, but between us and a Tampa police firearms case, they took our two cases to the Florida Supreme Court. The defense attorneys for those cases took it to the Florida Supreme Court to negate any of the interviews, or from both cases, the interviews from both cases. And Florida Supreme Court agreed and upheld that complaint by saying that, yes, it was inadequate verbiage in the Miranda warning. So at that point, the state's attorney's office for Florida pushed it then to the federal Supreme Court, where they in fact said, no, it is adequate verbiage as far as providing the individual with proper Miranda warning, and referred it back down to the district court. So once we got the green light that information, or that case was upheld and we can use it, then the interview came into the trial, and we were able to use his recorded statement and video recorded statement for the trial. So that was the most significant issue that we ran into, but all of the other evidence was admissible and it held up.
So you mentioned the defense's strategy, which was, yeah, he was there. You can't deny he was there because there's a bloody fingerprint. So we have to admit I was there, but I came in after somebody else murdered these two individuals. So what was your reaction to that the defense's strategy?
I would just have to say it was a very weak strategy. I think at that point they were scraping for any excuse to get him out of this. And myself and the state's attorney's office pretty much put in layman's terms, it was laughable. So based on all of the specific forensic evidence that we were able to collect, not just the bloody fingerprint, but all the other pieces to the puzzle, it was very hard for that one excuse to explain all the other evidence away. And they couldn't do that based upon what we had. So we didn't feel as though we were worried about it. So moving forward, based on Amanda Short's interview, her information, the physical evidence, the investigation documents, we had everything that pretty much locked in a solid case.
Yeah. So I assume working on the case and the personal nature, how, like you said, it definitely was one of the most gruesome crime scenes I've ever seen in my career. I actually can still see it to this day, and I'm sure you can attest to that. Did you have any or develop any personal relationships with the victims' families to where you felt personally involved in the verdict process, like invested in this case?
Yeah, I grew a strong relationship with Sousa's family. I think we had a bond because they looked at me as the person that was going to get them justice for their daughter. You know, she was, I'm not going to say that Jarvis is completely innocent. You know, he was dealing in drugs and he's still innocent. Believe me, he's a still innocent person. Unfortunately, he just had a different path. of how he did things, but Sousa was a completely innocent individual, a wife with children, and she was working in this construction company, and nobody deserves what she went through, no matter what, and nobody deserves what Jarvis went through, and I have to say for Jarvis, he ran for help, and he ran into that construction unit for help, and Sousa and Amanda Short were willing to help him. And from what we understand and how the crime scene looked, was basically once Richterink went around the corner to start stabbing Sousa, who was on the floor at the time, and trying to call 911, Jarvis actually took a bubblegum stand or dispenser and actually started physically hitting Richterink with the dispenser to get him off of Sousa. And this man has just been relentlessly stabbed. I mean, he is bleeding out really bad, but he still had the presence of mind of trying to protect her or help her during that. And and while he distracted Richterink, she was able to crawl into the back of the unit. And then Jarvis followed her into the back of the unit. They closed the door for safety. And at that point, Richterink literally just blew through the door and finished both of them off. So I have to give Jarvis credit. He, short of a hero, tried to save her and not himself, because he could have just ran out the front door and keep on running.
Right.
But he tried to save her, and it's just heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking just how all that unfolded. And we could have had a third victim by Amanda Short if he actually saw her in that unit.
So while you're waiting for this pivotal verdict, you've provided all this wonderful evidence. You've got the confession is in. And so now you've made relationships with this family. So you're waiting for that verdict. Was there any doubt on what it was going to be? Were you nervous about it? What were your feelings?
So I've been in the business for about 30 years. I've done I've been a part of a lot of trials, whether it was homicide investigations or just basic trials for any type of crime. And waiting for a jury verdict, you just never know whether there's that one person that would sympathize with Richterink and say they're not guilty, and you walk away with a hung jury after weeks of testimony and showing the evidence. That's in your gut. Based upon the case and how everything unfolded in trial, you feel confident that it's going to be a unanimous verdict. But you always have in your gut that is there one or two people that sympathize with the defendant. And these cases are big cases in comparison to, a lesser crime. So you just feel as though, you have some tightness in your chest and hoping that everybody comes back with a unanimous verdict. And thankfully, in this case, there was a unanimous verdict of guilty. And I was elated. The family was elated. But to me, it was more rewarding that the family got the justice, both families got the justice that they deserved, and that he was convicted. And at that time, before sentencing, was potentially going to death row.
Awesome. Are there any aspects of the case that still linger in your mind? Unresolved feelings, unanswered questions?
So the most significant aspect of the case was the motive. We knew Richterink was purchasing his marijuana from Jarvis, which is considered normal in the drug dealing world. What is also considered normal are drug ripoffs, where you can threaten Jarvis to give me your drugs or not, and then you leave. But in this case, it just seemed like it was personal. He began stabbing Jarvis relentlessly, never collected the drugs. And like I said earlier, he walked casually from Jarvis's unit down to the construction unit. Like there was no sense of urgency, or I got to get to this guy and kill him as fast as possible. I mean, it was just very, very strange. And unfortunately, in this case, Sousa, again, like I said earlier, was a witness elimination, but he just continued stabbing both of them until they passed away. So that perplexes me, because we just never could develop a factual motive. You know, he didn't make any admissions in his interview statement that would lead us to believe that it was something more than a drug ripoff that we were theorizing, but it just seems so personal. And we could never develop information to say that they had a personal rift between each other. You know, we even focused on Rick DeRink. He had a girlfriend at the time, and did she know Jarvis? And then Jarvis, were they together for some reason? And then, you know, was he a jealous person of Jarvis? And we couldn't even make that link together. So that will always be in my mind as to why did he do what he did? Because if you're just ripping somebody off for drugs, you know, just out in the regular street world, either you shoot somebody once if you have a gun and then you run, or you do nothing at all and you just leave. But for whatever reason, he just a light switch did turn on in his head, and it just became personal, and we will never know why.
Yeah. What advice would you give to young detectives or students in criminal justice based on your experience in this case?
Well, one of the biggest, the first thing, it's a two-parter for me, but one of the first things is to consider is writing detailed reports. Whether you are a young police officer or deputy on the road and you're responding to any type of crime, especially a murder homicide investigation, writing detailed reports. Be very thorough in your reports. Write down everything that you observe, everybody that you have spoken with. Everything should be in detailed writing, because eventually that's going to be your notes when you go to trial. When you go to trial, the only thing you can refer to is your report. And if you're sitting on the stand and an attorney is grilling you, and you ask the judge, can I refer to my report, and the attorney, and you refer to your report, and the information that the lawyer's grilling you on is not in there because you failed to document it, that's embarrassing. That is embarrassing. Thankfully, I personally have always been detailed in my reports, so I've never looked up from a report and say, I don't know the answer to your question, unless it's just a very odd question by an attorney that who would know the answer? Nobody knows. But writing very detailed reports is crucial, and not only for the trial, but for the detectives or whomever is following up on the case, because they need that information that you have written down to coincide with their observations in their reports. So all that information should be consistent across the board and uniformed, so that way what you did carries over to what the detective did and the information that they followed up on what you did. So that is very key to any investigation, not just a homicide investigation. But the other side, I want to just really talk quickly that I know media, television, and movies give you a taste of what police work is like, but until you're actually out there doing policing, you'll actually experience the realities of dealing with the worst of society on a daily basis. So it's stressful work and relenting, but also rewarding by capturing the evil that preys upon the innocent. And in my case, as a homicide detective, when I arrived on the crime scene of a homicide investigation and the supervisor selects you as the lead detective, the weight of the world is on your shoulders now to solve the case and capture the killer. I can't even in words tell you what that weight feels like. And a part of that weight is bringing justice to the victim and the victim's families. So my advice is that you'll have to make a lot of personal sacrifices. You'll have to be prepared to work endless hours, up to 24 hours straight if need be, based on leads. And developing relationships externally and internally to help you make your job easier, and never give up. It could take a day, weeks, months, or years to solve a case, but patience is key in those types of investigations.
And I mean, here we are 21 years later, and it's still a significant, and I would say a little bit traumatic event in both of our careers, being involved in this case. And it's one the families will never forget, and definitely once you've worked it, you'll never forget it. So I concur with everything you said. Is there anything I forgot to ask you or that you want to add?
No, it's pretty much that's the crux of the case and how it unfolded, and it's one I'll never forget.
Well, I certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to talk to us about this case. It's been forever since I've seen you, so getting together even on Zoom is always a good time. So I appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right.
Thomas Richterink was arrested for the double homicide in October of 2003, and he was indicted for these offenses on November 4th, 2003. He was found guilty in 2005 and sentenced to death. At the time of his sentencing, a 12-member jury only had to reach a simple majority, and then the judge would determine whether the facts supported death. The vote was 7-5 for death, and Judge Durrance sentenced him to death. In 2017, Richterink's death penalty sentence was set aside based on a Florida Supreme Court ruling mandating jurors agree unanimously on evidence supporting the death penalty. It should be noted that last year this legislation on the death penalty was once again changed. In April of 2023, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed legislation that lowered the threshold for juries to recommend death sentences from a unanimous vote to a vote of 8-4 in favor of death. Having heard the facts of this case, what do you think? Do you think Thomas Richterink is guilty? I'd love to hear your thoughts. As we close this episode, it's impossible not to reflect on the tragic loss of Allison Sousa and Jeremy Jarvis. Their lives were cut short by an act of unimaginable violence. Their futures were stolen, and they left behind grieving friends and families whose lives will never be the same. The pain of losing a loved one in such a horrific way is something no one should have to endure, and it's a stark reminder of the real impact these crimes have on so many lives. Let us not forget the human element behind the headlines. These were real people with dreams, hopes, and futures that were cruelly taken away.